you very There we go. So yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to talk about my PhD research today, which is all about queer histories in the English countryside, roughly between 1800 and 1950. So let's get right into it. So I thought it would be appropriate to start with a question I ask myself almost every day, which is who am I and why am I doing this? So I'm an archivist, I'm a writer and a historian, and the reason why my archive background is significant to this research is that I'm approaching this topic from a collections perspective. I believe that research into historical LGBTQ people should be grounded in archive and museum collections, as opposed to other approaches that people have used, like queer theory angle, which I think can be a little bit impenetrable at times. Also, a knowledge of how archives are structured and catalogued is really beneficial when you're trying to tease out these sorts of hidden histories from within collections. So, what got me interested in this topic? Well, in 2021, I was working for the Merle as a collections researcher, and part of that role was to draw out underrepresented histories from amongst the collections. So, when we had a promenade play on LGBTQ histories staged at the museum, and also a display from contemporary queer rural artists going up, it seemed like a no-brainer that we'd want to accompany this with a small exhibition on historical LGBTQ people in the English countryside. At least it was a no-brainer until we looked on the Merle Collections catalogue and we found absolutely nothing related to LGBTQ people in the rural past. So if you think about it, that makes perfect sense. The museum had never gone out of its way to collect that sort of material before. Um, of the tens of thousands of objects and archives held by the museum, some of them must have been owned and used by LGBTQ people. But when they donated it, they're either hiding their sexuality or more likely they just didn't think that was relevant to the donation they were making. And this opens up a whole other conversation about collecting policy, but I'm sure that's a conversation that most of you are more qualified to have than I am. So we couldn't find anything in the Merle collections. And at that point, I decided to look into literature to see what research had already been done on rural queer histories in England. But here's what really surprised me, which is that I couldn't find anything there either. There's been so much done on urban queer histories, but nothing on the rural. And there's a couple of possible explanations for this. Firstly, most of the people who are doing queer research were from urban academic circles, so are more inclined to do research that reflected their own experiences. And there's also more archive material available for an urban context. So like evidence of gay activism in cities and evidence of meeting spaces like gay clubs and bars. But the fact there was no literature did shock me. So putting together this exhibition, which was titled Queer Constellations, we were working from a bit of a blank slate. We decided to take inspiration from some work that was going on with the Berkshire Record Office called Broken Futures, where they were looking at court records relating to convictions of gay men and trying to tell these stories in a different light. And given our limited time scale, we decided that looking for evidence of court cases in rural England was our best bet, and we found the British Newspaper Archive to be a really useful tool for doing that. By searching the archive for names of rural villages in a few different counties and combining these searches with the legal terminology for same-sex relationships, we were able to find quite a few rural men who were convicted. But we wanted them to be more than just a conviction in our exhibition. So we used Ancestry to find out more about them, including their living situation, their occupation, so on. And using this information, we were able to pair each of the men that we found with objects from the Merle collections to show what their lives might have been like. So yeah, that was Queer Constellations. It was only up for a few months, but it felt like it had a really major impact with inquiries coming in about the exhibition years after it was deinstalled. And ever since then, I just couldn't get it out of my head that this was such a huge gap in knowledge, both for queer history and for rural history. And what if there were other sources that were hiding these histories? What about women in romantic or sexual relationships who wouldn't show up on court records because same-sex relationships for women were never illegal. So when I found myself in a position to undertake a PhD, that I had to go for it. And here's just an example of a panel from the online version of the Queer Constellations exhibition, which we uploaded to accompany the physical installation. It reflects a couple of interesting things. So firstly, we were able to find a few pairs of men who were convicted together, suggesting that they were in a relationship with each other. And something I also really liked about the exhibition is that it diverged from the usual bright rainbow colours that you would usually associate with LGBTQ displays. And it just consisted of the brown objects that we associate with the Mo and many rural museums. I think this conveyed the message that these people were just ordinary working men who had to show sort of extraordinary bravery just to be themselves. So I started my doctoral study in October last year, so I'm still fairly new to it. My first port of call was the collection of farm records at the Mill. This was a collection that I'd had my eye on for quite a long time, as it has fantastic potential for researching social histories of rural England. In particular, I was interested in diaries and letters, as these documents are more personal, more likely to contain the sort of reflections and, if I'm honest, gossip at times that I'm looking for, as well as documents written by and to LGBTQ people. I'm also looking for people who are giving opinions on the way that LGBT people are treated, and perhaps reacting to a local conviction in their diary. And I've already learned some really valuable lessons on how best to approach these sources. So, as you can imagine, the vast majority of the contents of these archives aren't relevant to my research. So I've developed a skill in sort of skim reading for words that jump out at me. Anything to do with relationships, socializing, or even criminal prosecutions is something that would lead me to read the document in greater detail. I've also made findings about which types of documents might be the most useful. So, for example, if a document was labeled as a farm diary, that would typically just list the farm tasks completed each day. But if something was described as a diary of a farmer, then it's more likely to contain thoughts and reflections on personal activities and events. And my PhD doesn't aim to just find stories of historical queer people in rural England, but also to develop a methodology for future researchers. So that's why these sorts of findings are important, so that I can advise others on how best to do this research themselves. I've also come to appreciate that some sources can provide useful revelations, even if they don't make any direct reference to queer people. So, for example, the Three Rivers Museum were kind enough to send me the diaries of John White, who was a farmer from Hertfordshire, and he kept a diary over the course of several decades in the late 19th century. So it included social ongoings, family milestones, his daily life. He doesn't mention queer people at all, but some of his recollections can help break down some of the sort of misconceptions that we might have about rural isolation, which is one reason why you might not expect to find gay people in relationships in the countryside. So, for example, he mentions a lads' club that his wife runs in the local village, um, which provided social opportunities for young men in the surrounding countryside. And when I searched online for lads' clubs, I could only find mention of them in cities. So I found that interesting because this revealed that maybe young rural people had more meeting spaces and more opportunity to find people like them than we previously imagined. And finally, it's amongst farm records that I've made arguably the biggest discovery of my PhD so far. So I won't go into too much detail on this because I've written a blog post which you can read if you like, and if one of my friends at the Mo would like to link that in the chat, that would be brilliant. So just to summarise, amongst correspondence relating to Vale Farm in Kent, I found a letter that was written by a man called Austin Gardner from Auckland in New Zealand, and it was written to a man called William Champion, who lived on Vale Farm. The letter is dated 1883, and within it, Austin describes his relationship with William's recently deceased brother, Thomas, And the language he uses is very indicative of a relationship between Austin and Thomas. So most notably, for example, the request for the destruction of previous letters that Austin had sent to Thomas, which is a telltale sign of a same-sex relationship, as letters were frequently used as evidence in conviction in court cases, so they'd be destroyed once they were read. Thomas is described as chief amongst my kind friends by Austin. And Austin also relates how the nature of their relationship had been subject to gossip amongst the local community. And I found this letter in the very first week of my archive research. So that really gave me belief that it was worth doing. And there must have been a lot of people like Thomas and Austin out there. This is the first page of Austin's letter. So I said earlier that I skim read these letters looking for words to jump out at me. And the word I spotted here was intimate, which is about 8 lines down on the right-hand side. You might be able to see it there. So that word really kind of jumped out amongst other letters in this folder relating to kind of farm tithes and rents and other various economic things. So on this page, there's also the request for a photo of Thomas, and also the demand for the destruction of letters towards the bottom of the page there. Another resource which I would recommend for any social history project relating to 20th century England is mass observation. So this was a project set up in the 1930s, which aimed to essentially survey the British population and learn their opinions on a whole range of different issues. So it just catches the end of my time period, but it was something that I had to look into because I heard it contained some opinions on sexuality, and these were opinions coming from ordinary working class people from all across the country, including rural areas. And what makes mass observation even better is that a lot of it has been digitized, so you don't have to travel to the keep in Brighton, which is where the physical material is kept. And the digital platform allows you to search for keywords, which for my purposes was really, really useful, as I can search for words that were used to describe queer people, not just in a criminal sense, but also in terms like homosexual that were used by the general population. And each respondent had to list their age, gender, profession, and location. So it's easy to find out more about these people and where they were living, whether they were rural or not. And additionally, mass observation can be used to track the usage of certain words and what they meant and what they were used for. So I searched for just simply for the word gay amongst responses from the 1930s and 40s. I had over 1,000 results. I looked through all of them, and only one related to a potentially homosexual individual, which shows that that term wasn't used for same-sex relationships at that time. And the collections can be searched by themes as well. So this is under a heading called topic collections, and there is an entire collection on sexuality, which I've only just started searching through. So there may be more to come there. But yeah, I'd never heard of mass observation before I started this research, and I just wanted to reiterate that if you're doing any kind of social history project from this era, regardless of the theme, it's well worth a look. So mass observation also collected diary responses, and here's a snippet from one such diary that I found when I was searching for the word homosexual, which you can see is highlighted. So the diary dates to 1937. The author is a male student from Marlow, which is a market town in the Chilterns. He's discussing homosexuality with a friend, and the logic for why homosexuality exists isn't, quite the same as our understanding today. They do agree that attempts at repression by society are harmful. So this account, like others I found, helps to build a picture of how tolerant people could be outside of the bigger cities. My most significant finding amongst mass observation was someone who I felt deserved their own slide, and that's Enid Barrow. So Enid was the only person I found who self-identified as homosexual, and also as an invert, which in the 1930s was an incredibly rare thing to find. She typifies the kind of queer person that I've come across a few times now, someone who met their partner in the city, but then moved to the countryside and actually ended up being much happier in the countryside. So her move was instigated by the outbreak of World War II and the opportunities of the Women's Land Army. And what's so great about mass observation is that once I knew Enid was queer from a couple of her responses, I was able to search for all of her survey responses on different things using her unique kind of respondent number. And I found out her opinions and her feelings on a massive range of topics. So clothes shopping, discrimination in society, even cannibalism at one point. She said she'd be up for trying that, which I think was ironic, but who knows. Um, Beyond mass observation, Enid was also a writer. She wrote her memoirs, which have just last year been republished and serve as evidence of her daily life while working on a number of farms during the war and afterwards. So she makes some really interesting observations on gender. She's aware that she's often the only woman on the farm teams that she works on, but she doesn't feel like she's treated any differently to the men around her. And she also remarks on rural crafts as well, and how the gender roles aren't necessarily what she expected there either. So she doesn't directly talk about her sexuality much, but it is clear that she's in a relationship with a woman. At one point during mass observation, she remarks that she is mentally a man. I don't think we can tell from this exactly how Enid would have identified if she was around today. She might only be saying that because she thinks that being attracted to women makes you mentally a man, as she says, or maybe she would have been transgender in the modern understanding. But Enid doesn't particularly seem too fussed about that sort of thing. She just gets on with her life in a very kind of matter-of-fact way. But what is clear is from her memoirs is she was accepted by the community in Little Everston in Cambridgeshire, which is where she lived in a cottage with her female so-called friend. She operated a local library service for young people. She became really involved in local gun culture and shooting. She took great pride in her agricultural skills that she learned on the farm. She says very clearly that she would never consider going back to the city. The only thing she misses about London is the variety of cheese you can get, which, and as well as being the most interesting person I found, Enid tends to be quite relatable as well. And here we have a photo of Enid alongside probably my favourite passage of hers from mass observation. So again, that first sentence is quite relatable. And it also gives us an idea on her motivations for moving to the countryside. So as well as being proactive and finding these stories on my own initiative, I've also been fortunate enough to be approached by various people who've made some really good suggestions. So Cedric Morris and Arthur Lett Haynes, who are a same-sex couple of artists, lived in rural Suffolk. They're an example of that. The Granary Gallery in Berwick will soon be opening an exhibition on the artwork of the two of them. And they asked me to do some archive research on their relationship with each other and with the countryside. So I was really happy to help them with that. And having originally met and lived in cities, specifically the artistic scenes of London and Paris, Cedric and Let, which is what they were known as, moved to rural Suffolk in 1930 before opening an art school there towards the end of the decade. And their archives, which I looked at Tate Britain, reveal a relationship that could be quite, vitriolic, quite antagonistic at times. And it provides a really good illustration for how rocky a relationship could be when they were living at a time of persecution and how they didn't really have the words and the terminology we have now to properly convey how they felt towards one another. So Cedric in particular had a longing for a rural life. The natural world was a really major focus for his artistic outputs. His letters to Let repeatedly show a romanticization of the countryside. He used words like primitive to describe the landscape. He used the word peasant to describe the people. And at times it almost seemed to kind of physically affect him. He said that at one point, he said he was left feeling dizzy at the sight of a Welsh landscape. Um, And something that I found really eye-opening about the archives of Cedric and Let was evidence of their network of queer friends and colleagues in the countryside. So shortly after they moved to the countryside, for example, Let's diary records a visit, a social visit by two men called Oswald Balfour and Jack Webb, who Let describes as boyfriends. And given this was in 1930, it's the earliest instance I've ever seen of two men being described as boyfriends. Um, and also the letters between Cedric and Let don't use the kind of euphemistic language I've seen in other letters by queer people. It's very clear from the letters that their relationship is sexual in nature. And writing those kinds of letters is obviously a very risky thing to do at the time, as I mentioned earlier. So I think that shows a kind of implicit trust they had in each other and in their local community. They genuinely never thought that they would be prosecuted, and they never were. So this is a painting of Cedric Morris by his friend and mentor, Frances Hodgkins, called The Man with the Macaw. So she herself, Frances, is thought to have been a lesbian, and so it's just one of the many queer people that form part of Cedric and Let's network. I'm sure someone with more artistic acumen than I could make all sorts of observations about what this painting says about the sexualities of artist and subject. So I feel like I've barely scratched the surface so far, honestly, of sources that might contain queer rural histories. Here's a brief rundown of where I plan to go next. So in the next few weeks, I'll be visiting Dorset Museum to consult the archives of David Brinley and Norman Notley, who were a couple who lived together near Corfe Castle from around 1920 onwards. And early indications show that they were celebrated by their community. So, like Cedric and Let, I'll be going through some diaries and letters to find out their relationship with the countryside and with the community. I'm really keen to start looking through records at National Trust houses. So, for example, Sissinghurst have already done some amazing work on the same-sex relationship of Vita Sackville West, and I want to expand on that with them. I want to continue to use newspaper reports on court cases to find more evidence. I haven't really done the kind of criminal angle yet in this project. Court records are probably the most popular method amongst current queer researchers for finding histories, and they definitely do have a role to play in my work as well. So I'll probably be picking a few county record offices to try and find more cases and work alongside the National Archives too, who've already expressed an interest in my project. An area that I haven't looked at in particular detail yet, but will do so later, are archives that have an LGBT focus as opposed to a rural focus. So instead of trying to find the hidden LGBT bits in a rural archive, I'll be looking for the hidden rural bits in an LGBT archive. So yeah, they will mostly have an urban focus, but if there are rural snippets, I will hunt them down. And another idea I quite like to get my head around, haven't not quite there yet, is that of alternative communities or queer communes, which is places where queer people would kind of flock to as they became known as places where a range of identities and sexualities could be expressed. They could be villages or small towns. So, for example, another researcher at the Merle is looking at Chipping Campden as one of these alternative communities because it has connections to several queer individuals like Charles Ashby and Edward Carpenter. So evidence for the existence of these communities can be really hard to find. So it might be an area where I just keep an eye on what other people are doing and see where that leads. But most importantly, I would love to work with any of you who have collections which you think may have LGBTQ plus connections, and I'm always keen to write articles for your websites or have discussions about co-curation of exhibitions or anything like that. So finally, as rewarding as this research is, there is a reason why so little of it has been done before. And just in case you wanted to undertake this sort of work yourself, I thought I would share some of the potential pitfalls. So most obviously, the lack of archival evidence means that I am looking for needles in haystacks, particularly true for farm records, where I'll have day after day of reading diaries and letters that have nothing at all to do with queer histories. And to be honest, I suspected at the outset that I wouldn't find anything at all in the farm records throughout my entire PhD. So the discovery of Austin and Thomas that I mentioned was quite a good find, especially that early on. Terminology has also provided a sort of a multifaceted challenge throughout. So firstly, the terms within the records themselves. So when written by non-queer people, records will often describe queer people in terms that are now slurs, which can provide a challenge for both researchers and archivists. So researchers won't be typing these slurs into the catalogue necessarily during their searches. And some archives and museums won't want these words on their websites and their catalogues at all, through fear of reputational damage, which can make finding these words, these records, sorry, harder. Archivists and other collections professionals in the past also didn't highlight LGBTQ plus records in their catalogues because they were either concerned about the stigma of it, or they didn't know the signs of how to spot a queer person in a document, or they didn't think it was relevant or important. Even today, a lot of archivists are committed to archival neutrality, which is something that still a lot of archivists are taught as the way to do their job. Because I've studied as an archivist, it may or may not be the same in the sort of museum studies training as well. So they won't include something in their catalogue, which some would say is speculation, which many times it is. You can only be, 95% sure that there's a same-sex relationship going on when people are using the sort of euphemistic language that you find. And when written by queer people themselves, the letters and diaries will use that sort of euphemistic language due to fear of discovery, and also because queer people just didn't have the array of terms that we have now to identify themselves. So that can make searching under keywords more difficult. And finally, I myself struggle with working out which terms I should be using to describe the people that I find, because I usually end up using words that the individuals wouldn't have used themselves to describe themselves. So, for example, with Austin and Thomas, it feels disingenuous to call them a gay couple because they lived 100 years before the word acquired its modern meaning. But at the same time, if I use a more kind of academic, safe term like sexually dissonant is one that I've heard, I risk turning away the kind of wider general audience I want to communicate with, because I want to use terms that wider audience will understand. So these are the kind of conversations I often have with myself. And finally, as a museum, you will unfortunately have to consider being called out by certain elements of social media or even traditional media if you work with LGBTQ plus histories and audiences. I won't go into specific examples here, but all I'll say is that in my personal experience, the reception to this work has been overwhelmingly positive amongst both academic circles and a wider audience. So it's sensible to be prepared for, negative comments, that sort of thing. But please don't let the potential for that put you off. I promise you that the engagement that you get will be a net positive. So I thought finally I'd show you the image of the catalogue entry for the letter that we saw a bit earlier on, that contains evidence of the relationship between Austin and Thomas. So it's one of the few letters within this collection that has its own individual entry. So I think the cataloguer, who probably catalogued it in the early 1970s, knew that there was something special about it, but didn't want to take the extra step of saying that there may have been a same-sex relationship going on. And this makes the letter difficult to find for researchers who are interested in queer histories. Because, of course, if I'm putting in any terminology that relates to same-sex relationships into this, this file isn't going to come up because it doesn't have those terms associated with it. But yeah, that's enough of my waffling for now. But please do bear me in mind if you want to produce LGBTQ plus content in the future and you want to work together, or you want me to do some research amongst your collections. I'm always happy to have conversations about that. But yeah, thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to potentially hearing from some of you.
Fantastic, thank you, Tim. And what an offer of being able to work more closely. does anyone have any queries, any suggested links or ideas that that Tim could be exploring? And huge thanks to our Merle colleagues who have also put the online version of Queer Constellations and the blog that you mentioned about Thomas and Austin in the chat as well. So those links are there. Ree.
Just to get things started, oh sorry, I'm on the wrong screen, so I'm staring off into space. I was just thinking, Tim, I've just sent you some of that stuff I found about the various farmers who got caught in Reading. And a lot of it refers to a specific place by the river in Reading as well, which kind of suggests that it might be a cruising ground. And I was thinking about cruising and getting away from things because one of the part of the work with Reading Jail, one of the things they said is that people didn't always have like private domestic spaces where they could spend time together, and so they were often using kind of outdoor spaces or kind of public spaces, and that's how, you know, men definitely got caught. And I was just thinking, on the one hand, you have these farmers who are coming into Reading to meet up with people where there's a greater mass. So they're kind of coming into more urban areas. But then potentially you also have people, especially with the kind of motor cars and stuff like that, using rural areas as places to kind of meet people. So it's not necessarily always kind of, there's people who live in the countryside coming to cities, and there's also people who maybe live in cities using the countryside as a place to kind of escape prying eyes. And I just wondered, you know, you were talking about communities, whether you'd thought about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd be very surprised if that didn't happen because it's yeah, like I said, it's something I found with Enid Barrow and others that more generally, if people wanted to, you know, get away from prying eyes or wanted to be able to be more private in their relationships, then they would, you know, meet in cities and then go and live in the countryside, and that goes not just for gay and lesbian people, but also for transgender people as well. I found it easier to pass in the countryside. But in terms of, you know, sort of like day trips out in the countryside to get away from those prying eyes, it's it would be quite hard to know where to look for the evidence of that. But if I do work with police reports in those areas, then that's definitely something which I would hope to find, or possibly expect to find, because it's something that I found in the kind of urban histories, is that there were these well-known places that were often in relatively public spaces where people would know to meet and do the whole cruising thing. So yeah, I would be very surprised if that didn't happen. But as always, the biggest challenge with this is knowing what evidence type is going to be the one that tells those stories.
Ollie.
Uh, Tim, thank you. That was great. And it looks like you're making brilliant progress. And yeah, I think you've probably heard plenty of me waffling on at you over the years. So I'll keep it brief. But I had one very quick observation based on Ray's point that she raised, which just amused me. It reminded me that the most famous, I think, and probably oldest queer venue in Oxford is actually a pub called the Jolly Farmer. I think that connection only dates back to the 80s, so it's not relevant to your research. And the other point I wanted to raise or sort of ask about is about connections to other kind of countercultural movements. You mentioned Vita Sackville West. I think I've probably mentioned to you in the past that Michael Pitt Rivers, the landowner whose trial led to the Wolfenton Report ultimately in the decriminalization of homosexuality. He was a member of Kinship in Husbandry, the precursor to the Soil Association. Vita Sackville West, I think, was involved peripherally in organics. Eve Balfour, I think, probably had a long-standing same-sex relationship. Again, another organic farmer. I just wondered whether there are other sort of routes into this through thinking about people who clubbed together in other kind of countercultural networks that weren't necessarily about sexuality, and whether those were spaces and places that were a little bit more accommodating to different sexualities, and whether you found any more evidence of that. I mean, I'm just...
Yeah, the whole, in general, the question of of a rural queer culture is something that is that I would really like to pin down, because that obviously that culture in urban areas is more easy to identify. I think the closest that I've got with that so far is the Cedric and Let, those two artists that I talked about, and the network that they had all over the country with other queer artists. And I think the kind of art they were doing, he says, with no knowledge of art whatsoever, was kind of counter to the more heteronormative art that was also going on. And they had those different people they could talk to, and they always had these kind of hubs in different places of the countryside where they would gather and meet and have their sort of scandalous discussions about what kind of counterculture art they would do next. So Charleston Farmhouse, where the Bloomsbury group met up, is another example of that. So that's somewhere else that I want to visit. But yeah, it's interesting in terms of whether you can find out anything in that vein on the working class level as well. I think that might be a bit more difficult, because they're probably going to be a bit less concerned with the counterculture side. But I certainly think so, and that ties into the whole question mark over communes as well, whether there were certain towns and villages in which there were greater tolerance and acceptance, and it was where people would flock to, and whether that came from a certain type of politics in that town that led to that coming about. So I hope so. But again, it's another. If I find evidence of that will be a sort of a massive breakthrough. But until then, it's probably that did happen, but we can't really say for sure.
Rachel Kids just put a comment in the chat about Eve Balfour and her sexuality, and the fact that she was also a member of the Women's Land Army, the official history of which was written by Vita Sackville-West, believe it or not, in 1944, before the end of the war. And there is a proof copy of it in the Merrill Library, so I don't know that there's anything that got edited out in the final version. So check out both proof.
Yeah, I'd love to go into the Women's Land Army more. Maybe go through some of the Merle archives, and yeah, it seems like that was breaking so many barriers down. I remember proudly telling people in the Merle galleries all about trousers and how insignificant trousers were for the a kind of a women's cultural shift in the countryside. So yeah, I'm positive that there were tons of same-sex relationships going on in the Women's Land Army, which within itself was a counterculture type thing. So yeah, that's definitely one I want to look into more.
Fantastic. Rachel, at Gressonall, we've obviously got the Women's Land Army Gallery and everything. I don't know if that's any stories that have come out of the research on that.
Not that I'm aware of off the top of my head. Well, I'm not on mute, am I? No. But I definitely like to look into that more. Because yeah, we've got a lot of sort of stories and biographies about Women's Land Army, so I'll take another look at those. I was also going to ask more generally, because at Gressonall we're both a rural life museum and a workhouse museum. I wondered if rural records of rural workhouses was anything you'd looked at and found anything maybe in minute books or even punishment books that came up. We've recently done a big research project into workhouse nurses and didn't find anything explicit, but lots of women who nursed for all their careers and never married. And I just wondered if that was another group of people where maybe these relationships were happening.
Yeah, I mean, it will happen very often when I'm discussing this research, because it is all so new that someone will suggest a new kind of evidence, and I'll say, no, I hadn't thought of that in the slightest, but that is a brilliant idea, and I will look at it, because yeah, anything that is able to shed more light on women's relationships, I think is really, really valuable. Because there were at times at the start of this project when my supervisors were saying, you should probably just do the project on same-sex male relationships, because that's going to be so much easier to find through court records and so on. But yeah, I wanted to try and push beyond that. And there are so many stories of even 2, 3, 4, 5 women living in homes together who never married, in which the nature of their relationships is not, ever quite explicitly said. So anywhere in which we can get more explicit evidence on that is something that I'm very keen on. So I am writing that down as we speak.
Super. Victoria, you've put a link in the chat about some research from Queen's University in Belfast. I don't know if you know anything more about that or can share any further details on the link.
Yeah, if you click on the link, it leads you then to the wider project that Queen's and University of Ulster are doing, called Queer Northern Ireland. But part of that was they recreated a shed, like a rural shed. They identified a diary at the Public Record Office in Northern Ireland, and it was based on this a diary belonging to David Strain. And then they recreated the shed in which it was sort of like a sanctuary for him, where he could meet up with sort of friends and lovers at a time when obviously things had to be behind closed doors and very much hidden away. So it was like an installation piece where they recreated the shed structure, which he once had, and it was on display at the Ulster Museum, and then it also was displayed at the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland. And I think as well, Tom Hume, who was one of the lead academics on the research side, there's also a podcast now, which features that story amongst others that they're uncovering, in Northern Ireland in terms of sort of hidden histories. So yeah, something maybe to look into, or maybe you already know about it.
Well, I've had some really good conversations with Tom.
Great.
So yeah, so I think in the kind of UK context, Tom is probably the only other person who's doing this sort of research as well in the Northern Ireland context. So yeah, he's been a brilliant person to talk to. I haven't actually looked at the shed in great detail yet, so that will be
Yeah.
a post meeting activity, and that's amazing because I'm always looking for, because I look at everything through a collections lens and background, which is different to a lot of university academic type people. So I understand the challenge of how do I create an exhibition or display content relating to LGBT issues when I don't have anything in my collections which actually has that definite link. So doing this sort of thing, creating an environment in which people might have met up and then populating it with, because I haven't looked at it in detail, but presumably with objects from collections to make it more, realistic and lifelike. I think that's a brilliant way to do it. To use collections as a sort of illustrative tool for stories and different contexts that you find elsewhere. But yeah, I'll definitely look at that in more detail. Thank you.
Yeah, I think they worked with an artist and then they acquired pieces, from antique shops and things. They may have had either drawings or photographs of the interior of the shed, so they were able to kind of recreate what it looked like. And I think as well they had like sound elements and even smell to kind of emulate, the sounds and smells of the interior of the shed. So it was quite immersive when people went into it. So yeah, it was just like a different way of kind of obviously exploring that, as you say, with sort of limited, definitive collection pieces belonging to those individuals. So yeah, definitely maybe something that could spark an idea for others.
Yeah, Ollie.
I can't help but ask questions again, but I think I can see Seb there, and I just wondered, Seb, did you think about any of that for the 50s section in Beamish when you were developing that, or is that something that you're thinking of? For you're on mute, by the way. You're still on mute.
There we go. That's better. Yeah, no, I think it's things we're sort of actually starting to cut now. We did, I think we did touch on it through the research, but we also had a lot of changes of personnel over the course of the project. So I'm not saying we're retrospectively looking at it, but I think we are trying to broaden the stories we're telling sort of across the museum actually, and this whole period that actually the 1800s and 1950 side of this it's so not just the 1950s, but right from the earliest areas of our museum timescale. Yes, look at so actually that's a very interesting because that just covered that 150 years here, sort of covers us perfectly. So just really interesting, and also to look at the sources and the resources that are being used. So yeah.
Isabel.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of remind him as well of we worked with someone called Tim Alsop, who was doing work on queer rural life, who did the play that you talked about. And what I found interesting about that was less about individuals, but it was more about uncovering the life that you led. So for instance, I remember them talking about how there were fewer people who would identify as gay in the countryside because possibly counterculture things that they had to leave in order to be able to be themselves, and they had to go to urban places. And the other thing was about places where you could meet. So the idea of the hut, it brought to mind that there were certain pubs that people got to know about. And I think it was said in one of the interviews that he picked up that people were saying that that's because of drink driving. Obviously, rural pubs are sort of in decline, but often those pubs were in quite tucked away places, but everybody knew they were the gay pubs. And I think that there might be research that can be done about less the individuals, but more the sort of environment in which you can operate and live your life. And places like pubs and so on, the history of pubs and what they were known for and who went to them and so on might be an interesting area.
Yeah, it might be worth getting back in touch with Tim, and because when when I hear that kind of thing, which is really encouraging, that kind of knowing that certain places, certain pubs, certain meeting spaces were known as somewhere that were friendly to LGBT people. Like being able to find evidence of that would be absolutely amazing. So I might go back to him and ask kind of what his research process was, because that's the part that I think I'm really interested in at the moment, is finding out how he got there.
Yeah.
So that I can then go back into those same sources and look at it maybe through a slightly different lens in terms of trying to, because I'm trying to kind of build my project from the ground up in terms of using the archives, and using collections and basing everything in collections, because it is kind of easy sometimes to go around in circles, I think, in terms of saying, well, logically people must have moved to the cities to express themselves, find like-minded people, find meeting spaces. But then you could also say, oh, people like Ree was saying earlier, people might have moved out of cities to be away from prying eyes. So it's I think I'll write that down as well. Sorry, I'm writing everything down at the moment to get back in touch with Tim and ask about his sources, because those meeting spaces in the countryside is something that I'm just learning about a bit more. Like I mentioned, the lads clubs and the potential of that. So because obviously most villages, they would have just had one pub, which wouldn't have necessarily been a friendly meeting space for people of all sexualities. But if they did exist in the countryside, then and if there's evidence for that, then that's something I'd love to highlight. Thank you.
Sort of leading on from that, Dawn, I don't know if you're able to say anything more about the note you put in the chat about Edward Carpenter and his home at Millthorpe.
Oh, is my microphone working?
It is, yeah.
Yes. It was just thinking of, so I should maybe reveal, I work for the National Trust, so this is an area of work I'm really looking into. So definitely looking to connect after this, because obviously so many relevant aspects to this. But I've started to really look at trying to figure out those kind of networks, but like you were saying, the kind of that ephemeral sense of it and trying to pin those down a bit. And I think a lot of it has been coming up for me oddly in more like records of minutes around meetings of various political groups, but then actually there's like sometimes a recurring cast of queer characters within those. And alongside that, I was just mentioning with publications and looking at inscriptions in the front, because at the same time, that's where I've been able to kind of pin down a few more or deepening connections between people and getting a sense of what ideas are people like exposed to or choosing to engage with, even if they are potentially quite rural locations, that kind of access to ideas, like also including poetry and that kind of thing. So yeah, those little scraps that sometimes are piecing together something a bit more. Yeah, and also I've got a lot of love for Edward Carpenter with his socks and sandals, vegetarianism and all of that. So he's always got some interesting friends around him.
Yeah, and I think he was yeah. So like I said, I've been talking to somebody called Charlotte Fiel, who's working at the at the Merle at the moment, who's looking at Chipping Campden as a commune, and Edward Carpenter is involved in that as well because he was kind of around around that place, and they're almost societies that they were setting up there. They were all sort of involved in talking to each other, and it's a really interesting, this kind of almost, again, talking about wider networks that people might have had. I found out about something called the Order of Chironea, which is a secret society for the basically the cultivation of homosexuality that started around 1900, and there were lots of relatively famous people who were a part of that. And again, I was amazed that existed. So yeah, I'm very excited to work with, honestly, the National Trust in any way, shape or form, because I think the kind of the country homes and things like maybe even staff records at country homes have some fantastic potential, as those were going to be the epicenters of, of potentially meeting places for the upper classes, perhaps, and then that may have filtered down into the working classes around them. So yeah, I would love to explore that more.
Joe.
Hello there. I was just going to ask a quick question. You mentioned when looking through collections, a lot of the stuff that you're looking out for is based on language, terminology, sort of, I guess there's innuendo, euphemisms, maybe connections between people that might not necessarily be apparent to the casual observer. So I was wondering, for smaller museums, if they're looking to start with this sort of work, but maybe they don't have any sort of queer members of staff or volunteers or anyone that's got that sort of particular expertise. Do you have any recommendations for how those museums might start to make that work? Would it be a case of engaging with like local queer groups, LGBTQ plus people?
Yeah, that's certainly a good option. It's something that I've wondered about in the past, in kind of my collections past, in terms of speaking to local communities, because it can sometimes come across in terms of, putting the work on the community, which can be problematic. So it may be, appropriate to pay people for their time and that kind of thing. Was something I would absolutely recommend, is to get in touch with PhD researchers who are doing this as their topic and want to go through as many archives as possible, and volunteer to do so for no charge. So yeah, that's another option. But there are a few books out there. So I may have it behind me, which I don't know if you can all see. So this one is called A Practical Guide to Searching LGBTQIA+ Records, by Narina Shopland, who I think gave a talk to this group a couple of years ago. So Narina is absolutely brilliant. She's done loads of work in Wales, and it's quite a short book, very, very straightforward, and tells you what to look for when you're going through the records, what keywords to look for, what innuendos to look for all kinds of different groups. So that's a fantastic place to start, and I constantly go back to it. But yeah, make use of students, because they are often keen to do the work for you.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll definitely look at that book up. That's great.
Fantastic. I'm kind of thinking maybe we'll draw this to a close, unless anyone's got any further thoughts or ideas or queries to share. No immediate hands up. Tim, thank you so much for your time this afternoon, being so generous with the research that you've already undertaken, and top tips as well, and pitfalls to watch out for those embarking in it. You very generously also suggested that you may be interested in coming and supporting wider research. So I'm sure there'll be lots of knocks at your door in the not too distant future. But equally, via the Royal Museum's discussion group, hopefully we can keep this going, sharing any connections and any ideas that people may have to share. But huge thank you again for all your time, and to you all for joining us on this Chewing the Cud session. Hopefully see you at another session from the Royal Museums Network again soon, and thank you very much for your time.